All right, everybody. So welcome to chapter 2. So chapter 2 definitely gets into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty. We're going to be talking about the nervous system, cells, the brain, and the body. And this chapter will be separated into sort of themed components or topics that we cover throughout the chapter. All righty. So here we go. So you're here to basically learn about brain behavior and how we interact with our environment, how our environment affects us, the things we do, how it affects our body, our genetics, our behaviors, our physical makeup. We're going to cover so many things in this class. And most of that all starts with some of these basic components that we'll be starting with in this chapter. And in terms of the structure and a relationship between the brain and the body, then those really center on the nervous system, the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is nerves outside of the central nervous system throughout the body. So you can see here, and we'll be coming back to this a little bit later. Here's our spinal cord and our brain, and this is our central nervous system. And then we have our peripheral nervous system, and it's throughout all these, basically everything else that's connecting with our body. And it has all of these branches, and some of them voluntary, involuntary. We'll be learning a little bit more about these and in terms of how they're reacting in terms of times of stress and how they are helpful in calming down. And so this structure here is one of the big pieces that is really actually essential for sort of that brain and environment connection. The brain is fundamentally like a sensory processing instrument. It needs information from the environment, and that is what the senses are for. And then it tries to convert that sensory information into meaningful information that the person can make decisions with and act upon. And then we have also all this involuntary unconscious stuff going on at the same time too. So all of these pieces, this is what actually underlies some of the more complex behaviors that are really central pieces of our lives. Relationships and falling in love and doing super fun stuff, just movement oriented, like dancing, sports, basketball. There are so many things that you would learn about in terms of the timing and sort of the neural communication necessary to engage in some of the athletic feats that we see on the news and in sports on a daily basis. And then it's also going to be elements of our work, how we are interacting with our colleagues, and how we are, I'm going to sneeze. How are you interacting with our colleagues and pursuing applications? I told you guys that I wouldn't be able to edit that out right now, but there you just see, all of this stuff happening in real life. Excuse me. So at our workplace, we have our interpersonal relationships with our colleagues, pursuing our goals, and sort of some aspects of our sort of career paths, and all the time sort of searching for some of these balances between sort of life in this context of this mixture of sort of like work and play and the balance of those types of things. And so all of this, some of these deeper questions that we have about our relationships and how we make decisions and how we interact with people, these are all actually beginning at sort of in these physical spaces that represent the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Now, to take this back down to the sort of the piece that underlies all this and what we have to understand actually about how these communicate is you have to look at the cellular level. And that begins with the neuron, which we'll be talking about, and the structure of a cell in the sense that it has specific properties that are really essential for neuronal functioning and communication. So this is this is basically a cell membrane. And this is what wraps around any cell. And so in the book, they gave the example of a balloon, and that a balloon right now does not have any sort of permeable membrane. It keeps, air in and helps sort of separate what's inside and what's on the outside. But we don't need that sort of isolationist sort of approach in terms of how our cells and neurons function. We wouldn't have evolved if we did. So we need to have a semi-permeable cell membrane. And the semi-permeable cell membrane is exemplified here. And so you can see that it has particular properties. So it has sort of what's called a bilayer, 2 layers, and they call it a phospholipid bilayer because of sort of the lipids and the fats involved. And then we have these pieces in here that are hydrophobic. They do not like water molecules. So they actually try to stay together and to not come in touch with some of the extracellular and intercellular fluid. So extracellular is outside the cell and cytoplasm is within the cell. And all of these pieces that we see right here, we'll be learning about some of them, but not necessarily all of them for the scope of this course. These are some of the ways that content or materials pass from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. A cell cannot be sort of a closed system. It has to be able to bring in materials that are needed to construct proteins and enact sort of genetic, what's the word I'm searching? Enact genetic plans, shall we say. And then we also just have what we would need for the proteins involved for regular daily function, the energy the cell uses, and what it needs to do with the cellular waste. So we have things that need to come into the cell and things that need to leave the cell. And the cell membrane is an essential part of that process to make sure what comes in, and only when it should come in, and what leaves, and making sure it leaves so that it doesn't have any sort of detrimental effects on any of the pieces that are there in the cell, if it were cellular waste and things like that. So first off, we have this cellular membrane. And this cellular membrane lets sort of some things through, other things not. We'll be learning more about this when we get into neurotransmitters. And then all of that cellular membrane is basically right around, it's the casing that covers the whole neuron. And it changes a little bit based upon where it's at. But this here is the cellular body of a neuron. In the middle is the nucleus. And here we have the rough endoplasmic reticulum and the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, for making proteins and coding off of genes. We have the microtubules, which sort of transport content such as neurotransmitters, mitochondria. Here's actually the cell membrane, which would sort of show some of these pieces together. Cytoplasm, all of these here within inside. And the mitochondria, these are sort of the energy powerhouses of the cell. And this is where it'll sort of use energy and then need to kind of and let go of some of that waste. And then we have these particular branches that come off the cellular body. And this branch is sort of known as a dendrite. It is specifically trying to reach out to other neurons and to other dendrites so that they can communicate together. And some of these spaces where those interactions occur are some of these little tiny sort of spaces right here that are representing dendritic spines. And this, as you can see, you have 2 neurons sort of connecting here. So this is primarily where where dendrites would connect to other neurons. They connect sort of in these dendritic spine spaces, and you can see what that looks like over here. And so just from looking at this, you can see just an example of how many connections there are with other neurons. And this is a very, very simple graphic. But each one of these dendritic spines can be connected with multiple other neurons. It's not necessarily one. They can be sort of competing for some of the same space, and neurons are very, very prolific. And then here we'll have the myelin sheath, which we'll be learning a little bit later, and this helps with the action potential traveling very quickly. So looking at our neuron in a little bit of more greater detail, and we sort of use an example here of a particular type of neuron. Many of them look very different. I think this is a Purkinje cell. And so what here we have our cell body, and this is where we have this sort of information integration section. Here we have our dendrites up here with all of these little tiny spines where you see other things connecting with them. And so this is where information is collected from other neurons. And then this information is summed in various ways to see if it sort of reaches the threshold needed right here to kind of cause a cascade of interactions that would begin an action potential that would sort of flow down the cell to basically then send that sort of like, okay, well, here's my summed information, here's my cellular response to move on to the next cell, and that's what it sort of passes on down here. And at the bottom, you have these terminal buttons right here, and these terminal buttons are the things that are also going to connect with other types of dendritic spines, as you can see right here. So moving forward with this, we have these components that we reviewed. We have these dendrites, these dendritic spines, and we have the cell body and the soma. This is that sort of space right here. And then right off of that, you can't really see it too here, but you'll have in other diagrams, is basically the axon hillock. And this is where there's a certain amount of threshold that needs to be met for this action potential, which causes the flow of information to go down the axon and communicate with other neurons. And then you have these axons that have these axon collaterals, which is basically sort of extensions, sort of multiple places where the information might flow to, and so that it can be passed on to this separate axon, so you can have sort of two coming down, and then also sort of setting up connections with a potential different group of cells. And then you have the telodendria, which are basically these little tiny spaces sort of right in here. They're trying to sort of reach out and connect with other dendrites, and those occur at the end of the axon. And then as we went through, there's the little terminal buttons right there. Now, if we're going to take a closer look, because what happens at the end of the axon, where you have the terminal button and the dendrites meet, is the synapse. And this right here is an example of the synapse. So this is a dendritic spine that would be coming off like one of these little babies right here. And then this would be the end foot of, or sort of the terminal ending of the axon. And then you can see here, it doesn't even look like a space in between them, but that is the synapse. And there is a very small space in between them. Just like you have anything that sort of, runs up against each other. You put two, rubber balls next to each other. They're going to be next to each other, but there's still going to be very small space between them. And at a microscopic level, that very small space, a lot of stuff can happen. So, and what basically happens through this, the whole purpose of the neuron is this sort of flow of information from one neuron to the other. So you're going to have the dendrites that are getting information from other neurons. These are going to then these are going to then be strong enough to sort of signal and move into the cell body, where they're going to cause sort of changes where they're going to cause changes in the cell membrane to to set up an action potential. And then here, when it gets to the actual axon, because it's really right between the cell body and the axon, which you have the axon hillock, and this is where sort of like that all or nothing space kicks in. And once the action potential is started, it travels all the way down to the axon, down to the terminal button, down in here. And then it basically connects with a whole other round of dendrites. Maybe some of the same ones was, maybe some of the same as before, and sort of another new ones, and it goes through sort of this continual sort of communication cycle between the two neurons. It's not like a neuron's going to come up and it's going to grow out here and be like, hey, let's just synapse for a while. Once they, typically it will, once sort of these cellular sort of pathways are engaged, and then it can take a little bit to change them. Then you think of this as sort of what it would eventually sort of be involved in changing a habit or something like that. It takes time to try to relearn. You need to change your sort of alter some of your synaptic pathways to cause a different sort of behavioral outcome. And so this sort of just cycles through. Information comes in, the neuron integrates it accordingly, and based on, is it an excitatory neuron, is it an inhibitory neuron? So is it going to have an excitatory effect and make other neurons more active, or is it going to have an inhibitory effect and make other neurons less active? All of this sort of occurs within this continuous communication cycle. Now, here are some of the 4 types of neurons. We're actually going to go into more detail in these later. So I just wanted to basically sort of illustrate some of these. They have different structures. These structures sort of, and the differences between them evolve as part of the developmental process. All of these 4 different neurons and everything, the central nervous system, the brain, it all starts from one cell, and then it sort of differentiates from there. So we have sort of very early progenitor cells, and there's also undifferentiated neurons that haven't yet taken sort of the characteristics of these various neurons, and that happens as part of the sort of developmental process of the brain as neuron migration occurs, and that's when you get the differentiation of these types of neurons to serve sort of the interest of the specific regions of the body. So this type of neuron, for example, is in the olfactory nerve. This bipolar neuron has very, very specific roles in the retina. And then this is a pseudo unipolar neuron, which is sort of the new name, but they used to just call it, also known as basically a unipolar neuron. And this is used in sort of multiple places. You can see you would have one area which is primarily sort of dendrites, and then you'd have another area which was basically the axon terminals. And then this here is a multipolar neuron, where you would again have this primary axon, but you don't have sort of one, sort of main dendritic tree. You have a couple of them sort of right here. And so each of these structures, would understandably give rise to quite different communication structures in terms of how they would connect with the other neurons. And they also have, fairly significant differences in axon length. So axon length, especially when you're in the central nervous system going down the spine and the peripheral nervous system, axon length can be quite long. And so that's also going to determine sort of which neurons are going to be fitting, whether a unipolar neuron, a multipolar neuron, or an axonic neuron, which, actually has quite a short axon. All right. Now, moving on to this next piece. So we have the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system. We know that peripheral nervous system information, that's from the environment, and it comes into the brain. So this is known as sort of a sensory or afferent neuron. It brings information to the spinal cord. So it is part of the peripheral nervous system, and it brings information to the central nervous system, specifically the spinal cord. To help me remember this, I sort of think a sensory neuron that's bringing information in because it's getting information from the senses, and that the A for afferent sort of reminds me more of like A for access. Whereas the motor neuron, that's going to be the brain instructing the body to do certain things, and that's sending information outward to the muscle or gland sort of the spinal cord to have a cascade of actions down the stream, such as lifting up your foot from a painful needle. And that information is exiting the central nervous system. And so then I try to think of the E for efferent as exit. And so this kind of just is one of the ways that helps me remember some of the differences between the two. But basically, you have your source of heat or, again, some sort of painful sensory experience. And you have the finger, which is the receiver. So whichever area of the body is basically receiving the information. And you can see here, then this information is heading into the brain, and it's heading towards the spinal cord. And you can see that these information actually comes on from different sort of sides. So you'll have sort of this dorsal versus ventral, sort of the top versus bottom. And so this matters for sort of the organization of how information comes in, and it can affect the type of sensory or motor experiences that you would have if your spinal cord is compromised. And so once this information comes in, then the brain is going to basically send information down to the spinal cord, basically saying, like, stupid, do not touch and do not play with the fire, and pull your finger away. And it's going to ideally cause a sort of a reflex that would be automatic, that you wouldn't even have to necessarily think of it. And that would be this, that it can occur with this muscle. And so that is basically the cycle of information. Then the same thing, if, then the sensor cells right here would be basically, oh, I've removed it. Am I sensing to confirm that it's been removed? They'll actually, look for information from those cells to say, okay, they're no longer firing in response to, to a painful haptic stimulus. So basically to a painful sort of touch stimulus. So they are, so they're good. They're not under duress anymore, and they've been pulled away. But if you still had them sort of like, under the flame somehow, then they would get again and tell you to come and sort of move this information. So it will try to sort of pull it back, and it'll check to make sure, it will try to get you to pull your hand back, and then it will check to make sure that you've pulled your hand back. And this is easiest to see in these types of sort of stimulus response situations where you'd be touching something painful, but it's the exact same process that's also involved in picking up like a water cup or something like that. I got to bring this more into can't see it till I drink it. Yeah, it's my big water cup. So I have to sit there and hold this, and the weight of it, the grip that I need to have, and all this kind of stuff. This is information, that sensory information that would come into my brain to say, okay, wait, this is a big one. It's kind of heavy. I need to hold it harder, like hold it more. And versus when I'm going to be putting it down, I'm going to release it. I'm going to be moving to do some of these things. My movement will be to grasp it more, or to put it down, and my sensory information will confirm, am I grasping it more or am I putting it down? So this incoming and outgoing information from the brain, the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system is key basically in every single like physical behavior that we do. Even my gesticulating is going to have this sort of sensory sort of affect experience in terms of okay, whether I'm conveying this or whether I'm not. All right, so now we've learned about the neuron and its importance in communication, and we're going to learn about just a couple of other really essential cells that should really actually be celebrated just as much as the neuron, but they don't get as much credit because they're basically like the support cells. They're the one that's behind the neuron. It's like will help you get to do everything that you want to do, but the neuron gets all the credit. So glial cells, these are basically support cells that connect with the neuron in some sort of, in a number of various fashions, depending upon their function. So glial cells, they replicate and they assist with neural replication. They involve sort of maintenance functions for the neuron. They help with those. They remove dead cells around neurons, and removing dead neurons to make sure that you're not having the development of such similar types of development of scar tissue that over time would really affect some of the functioning of the nearby cells. Glial cells also create myelin, which we'll be learning about, but this is really special. Myelin is basically what helps information travel so quickly down a very long axon. And if we didn't have it, then we wouldn't really be able to actually use our extremities the way that we're able to. And here are some of the myelin sheaths that make that happen. And this is a oligodendrocyte. This is a specific type of glial cell, which we'll be learning out, and it creates the myelin. So this is just an example. The glial cells also act in the immune system to help with response, to help regulate it, to help provide sort of structure, and then providing structure and developing sort of myelin and a number of other sort of features. They also help in neuronal communication, and they play very essential roles in diseases in terms of whether they're going to help a neuron function, or if you're going to have issues with your glial cells, then that will cause neurodegeneration. And so they're oftentimes looking to see, okay, where neurodegeneration is occurring. Is there something going on within a glial cell, or is it a neuron, or these other pieces? Because neurons are so interactive with the rest of the space, they need, and they're so essential, then they definitely need extra support and plasticity. Now, one of the types of glial cells is a Schwann cell, and let's see if they would have the Schwann cell on here, but so Schwann cells, these are glial cells in the peripheral nervous system. So we have ones for the central nervous system and for the peripheral nervous system. And what it does is it creates myelin for neurons in the peripheral nervous system, which is a bit different in the central nervous system. And it also creates a pathway for regrowing axons after injury. Because if you have any sort of like nerve damage, or most any neurons, that your axon could get sort of severed, or just like my arm looks like. And once it gets severed, it has to regrow. And this is what you would do with sort of recovering from an injury. And so the Schwann cells actually kind of like, after the neuron gets damaged, they sort of shrink, but then they sort of stay in the same place and sort of act as like markers for when the neuronal growth factor is sort of coming through. And it's like, hey, we're still here. We'll tell you the path to grow, to connect with the other types of neurons that you need to connect to. And if you don't have some of those pathways for regrowing, then that's where you're not going to gain full function back. You could be missing it, or have things lead to other types of sensations and stuff like that. Instead of, you're going to have, scar tissue, things aren't able to improve. You're just not able to do some of those types of things that your body would be able to do normally. Now, the next type of, these are the ones that are in the neurosystem, central nervous system. So the Schwannian cell is outside the central nervous system. It's in the peripheral. But all the rest of the astrocytes, the oligodendrocytes, and the microglia, these are all in the central nervous system. And the astrocytes, they provide nutrients, they engage in neuronal repair, they help in sort of signals that the neuron will need additional materials for creating like essential proteins and things like that, or creating neurotransmitters. It could signal, for example, that the neuron needs more oxygen, or needs more of some sort of, as I mentioned, some of these other materials. And the astrocytes also protect the blood-brain barrier. And the way they do this is they'll sort of wrap around these capillaries right here and provide these sort of like, when they wrap around it, they'll actually have sort of these tighter junctions. And then when it's around the capillary, that prevents things from sort of flowing prevents things from sort of flowing through the capillary walls, which can protect them in the central nervous system. Then you have the oligodendrocytes. These create myelins for axons in the central nervous system, and these are the ones that we saw right here. They'll connect multiple ones, and they'll sort of wrap the myelin around it to create, these sort of semi-continuous myelination. And in between here, between these little tiny breaks, these are what's called nodes of Ranvier, and you will be reading about those later on as well. And the oligodendrocytes, they create myelin for the axons, and they also aid in development by sort of, helping with this myelination for the neurons and the glial cells to get to the right place within the sort of early development, sort of embryonic development growth plates, and sort of where this is when like neurons and cells are beginning to differentiate into ones that will serve specific areas of the brain and the body. And then we also have microglia, which are these smaller ones right here. And these are involved in immune function, and they remove sort of dead neurons from around the area, which, then if you leave dead neurons in here, they're not functioning as well. They can accidentally like trigger other neurons. This is why like scar tissue can actually inhibit aspects of brain function. And just as an example, seizures and things like that are common after after sort of an injury with scar tissue, because that scar tissue it's these neurons, but they're broken, they're sort of not regulating, and they're firing in ways that, are not opportune, are not involved in communication. And so so again, that can prohibit sort of the full development and the interaction between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And you don't want that sort of scar tissue going on at the cellular level. All right. So this is a point where in the chapter I would take questions, or excuse me, in the lecture I would take questions, but I'm going to be stopping this first section here. And so when I am coming back, it will be for the next section of the chapter.